Will the Committee on Governmental Relations please come to order? It is now time for the committee to consider today's consent agenda. Is there any objection to the approval of the consent agenda?
I have no objection, but I found the minutes rather brief. I don't know whether this is a practice of that committee. I personally would like more detailed minutes. That is just an observation.
All right. Hearing no other objections, and I'm correct, Trustee Sebelius said there's no objection. So hearing none other objections, the consent agenda is approved. On today's discussion agenda, we have two information items. The first information item is a state legislative update. The item will be presented by Garrett Ashley, Vice Chancellor, University Relations and Advancement, and Nicole Munoz Murillo, Assistant Vice Chancellor of Advocacy and State Relations. Please begin, Garrett.
Thank you, Trustee. Thank you, Trustee Farrar. And good morning, trustees. Today we will present a summary of our final budget advocacy activities and a legislative update. First, like Vice Chancellor Raylier, I want to thank our state leaders for prioritizing the CSU in the final budget agreement. The budget was carefully constructed to insulate higher education institutions and students from the turmoil that our state currently faces, and we are grateful for the leadership of Governor Newsom, President Pro Tem Atkins, and Speaker Rendon for their efforts. I'd also like to recognize the collective efforts of our campus leadership, the Chancellor, the Office of Advocacy and State Relations, students, faculty, and staff partners, and community supporters. Despite the stay-at-home order and advocacy that had to take place virtually, this coalition was able to adjust, working with our Advocacy and State Relations Office to ensure that the CSU remained a top budget priority. Beyond the final report on budget advocacy efforts, Assistant Vice Chancellor Nicole Munoz Murillo will also provide an update on legislative bill activity. Putting it mildly, this has been a very unusual year, and the next month will be very busy for the legislature as they have a truncated schedule to consider bills that have just been advanced to the second house for consideration. Nicole?
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Ashley. This board report is broken into two sections. The first portion is an update on the legislative process and legislation. The second section will focus on our budget advocacy efforts. And I'll begin with the legislative update. In May, the legislature reconvened from an unexpected recess, which was prompted by the stay-at-home order issued in March. Once they came back, they held policy and fiscal hearings, which were limited in number given the new safety protocols in place to COVID-19. Once both chambers finished their work, culminating with the House of Origin deadline, they adjourned for summer recess. This means that by the time they left for the summer break, legislation introduced this calendar year had to be passed out of the House in which it was introduced in order to remain active and continue in the legislative process. We had anticipated that the legislature would reconvene from summer recess on July 13th. Unfortunately, several members and staff tested positive for COVID-19 after concluding their business. Consequently, the Assembly and Senate are now expected to reconvene next week. Once the legislature returns, they will only have 5 weeks to conduct policy and fiscal hearings on bills that were just advanced to the second house and then pass bills to the governor for his consideration. This will be a very busy and accelerated end of session. I'd now like to take a moment to walk you through your agenda. There are 2 basic sections to it. The first section, starting on page 2, lists active bills introduced in 2020 that directly impact the CSU. These are the bills that are waiting to be heard in the second house. Turning to page 3, there is a list of bills introduced in 2019 that are still active today. I know that many of these bills are currently being held in the Appropriations Committee, were addressed in the budget, or are on the inactive file and will likely not advance. We have included them in your report because they are technically alive and our team is monitoring them. The second section of your agenda, beginning on page 6, are bills that are no longer advancing since our last meeting. During my last presentation to you, I conveyed that we anticipated that many bills would not advance this year due to a shortened legislative year and focus on bills made necessary because of the pandemic, which is largely why you see such a long list. I now like to highlight a few bills that impact the CSU that are moving forward in this legislative process. Going back to page 2, the first bill that I like to highlight on your agenda is AB 2288 by Assemblymember Evan Lowe. This bill is aimed to support the continued progress to degree for nursing students that have faced particular challenges due to the pandemic. For instance, many clinical placements were halted in recent months. Given the urgency of the situation, Governor Newsom signed an executive order that resulted in broader flexibility for nursing programs, including a greater proportion of nursing simulation labs being used as part of clinical placement requirements. This bill codifies these changes during a declared emergency, and the CSU is grateful to be able to support this bill, as it would help to facilitate the graduation of our nursing students, even in the midst of a pandemic. Moving farther down on page 2, I draw your attention to AB 2972 by Assemblymember Monique Limon, which we have discussed several times this year during my reports to you. This bill is sponsored by the California State Student Association and requires the CSU, UC, and community colleges to provide a system-wide training program for administrators related to issues impacting undocumented students. Our team has worked closely with the author's office and CSSA, and we are pleased that we were able to move to an official support position. Turning to page 3 of your agenda, I note that we were able to move to a support position of ACA 5 by Assemblymember Shirley Weber. This constitutional amendment allows voters to repeal the provisions of Proposition 209. ACA 5 was passed by both houses and will appear on the November ballot as Proposition 16. Finally, with respect to the discussion of AB 1460, which is found on page 5 of the agenda, I like to clarify where the bill is in the process and the timing associated with it. The bill is awaiting a final floor vote in the Assembly, which we expect next week. Once the bill is sent to the governor, he will have 12 days to act on it. We have engaged with the governor's office on a regular basis, expressing our concerns regarding legislative precedent, emphasizing the responsibility of the board to determine curriculum through the shared governance process, and reinforcing the CSU's core mission of inclusivity. We will update the governor's staff on the board's action today on the CSU Ethnic Studies and Social Justice proposal, and will continue our advocacy efforts if AB 1460 continues to move forward. I now like to turn to our budget advocacy efforts. I am encouraged by the partnership and advocacy that we have witnessed over the past few months. First, I want to give a heartfelt thank you to the coalition that came together to advance the CSU's budget request. CSSA, CFA, CSUEU, the Teamsters, and the Academic Senate and our campus partners have all worked together, pivoted to meet changing budget timelines, and utilize their constituencies to elevate our message through social media, phone calls, and letter writing. We also saw a huge amount of support for our social media campaign, #CSU for California, or excuse me, CSU for CA. With more than 10 million timeline deliveries prior to the finalization of the budget deal, our budget request was elevated to all corners of the state. We were also pleased that groups from the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, to the Central Valley Higher Education Consortium, to Families in Schools, to even the president of AARP California participated in this campaign. We also collected letters of support from nearly 40 organizations directed to the budget committees and the governor. These letters included the 3 statewide ethnic chambers of commerce, the Los Angeles County Business Federation, CSU alumni associations, and regional business and civic leaders. Finally, I want to thank our campus partners and especially the presidents who have cultivated strong relationships with their delegations over multiple years. Through these ongoing relationships, they've been able to convey the importance of the CSU to regional economies and for student opportunity. The final budget agreement shows that our state leaders put together an agreement that, despite a substantial budget deficit, aimed to reduce cuts to the CSU. Trustee Farrar, that concludes my report. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Nicole, for a very thorough presentation today. Are there any questions? I see Trustee Sebelius. Go ahead.
Yes, I have no question, but I want to express my strong appreciation for your report and especially for the responsiveness of you and your office. In our March meeting, I lamented that AB 2972, the proposal by Limon on undocumented students, was not in part of the state legislative report, and you were kind enough to put it on into your report in our May meeting, at which then I subsequently urged the support of the Chancellor's office, and you promised you would look closely at the language of that bill, and you did, and I'm very happy that the CO came to the conclusion that we can support that bill. So thank you very much. I know it's your first year in your new role, and I'm very, very appreciative of your responsiveness and thoroughness. Thank you.
All right. I see Trustee Eisen.
Thank you, Trustee Farrar. I have two questions. One is about ACA 5. And what I understand that we're going to vote on this in November, but if it passes and this provision is repealed, I would like to have a sense of what that means for the CSU. What kinds of things would we be able to do differently or better as a result of that? And my second question has to do with Steve Glazier's bill on the longitudinal database. What is the information that is intended to be collected under this bill, and for what purpose? And is there not already such a database? I'm curious about all of those things. Thank you.
So let me get to first ACA 5. The reason why we were able to move to support position of it, and I would also invite academic and student affairs if they want to weigh in on this, it was really because as part of graduation 2025, we have the goal of eliminating opportunity and equity gaps. And we, unfortunately, at this point in time, because of Prop 209, are unable to be able to have race-conscious policies. And so we're prevented from better focusing some of our programming for students based on those factors. We would be able to do more intentional recruiting of faculty of color. And so for those reasons, we moved to support position. And I think those are the things that would change. The other actually thing that would also change is for philanthropic funds. Every year, every campus has to turn away funding dollars because oftentimes donors want to be able to provide donations for a particular set of students. And because of Prop 209, we're unable to do that. So these are all avenues that would be opened if Prop 209 were repealed.
I would add, and I'm hoping that my technology will hold this go round, that scholarship support that would be targeted and strategic would also be a major factor, as well as when we, as Nicole just mentioned, strategic recruitment of faculty, but it's also strategic recruitment of students and retention of students that would benefit greatly from this bill.
Going to your second question on the longitudinal database, Not in this year's budget, but the prior year's budget, there's actually $10 million that was allocated for that purpose. And so that's why the bill hasn't been moving forward since that time. And I don't think Ed Sullivan is on right now, but I can get back to you with information about where we are in that process and what's been done since then.
Yeah, my question was more about what is the bill intended to achieve? You know, what kind of data do they want to collect? It just says individual student and workforce data in the summary, so I'm not sure what that means. You know, people get nervous when you start collecting a lot of data about them, but I'm sure Senator Glazer has a good reason for it and an intent about how to best use it. I just don't know that from reading your summary.
Yeah, so just to provide a little bit more context. So I think the bill needed the funding, and so when it was put into the budget last year, this bill was a vehicle to help get that done. That was one of the primary intents. So this is, I think, just an intent that data across the board from sort of cradle to career is needed to be able to make informed decisions from the legislative perspective. And so Ed Sullivan and his team have been really the point people on it since the $10 million was allocated. And so I'm not sure exactly where they have landed on specific information, but it was really the idea of cradle to career data information to be able to inform policymakers in their decision making.
All right. All right. I see Trustee Simon has a question.
Thank you. And if we don't have the information here, I understand. I'm curious in terms of our support position for Prop 16 or the overturning of 209. We talked about scholarships and outreach and particular opportunities that we're missing out regarding philanthropy. I'm interested in if this bill is successful, what impact will our campuses, our presidents and those who are seeking, whether it's a campus-wide plan or there's new construction. Currently, as I understand now, our state funds going after bids for construction or any contracts. There's no consideration for women or minority-owned businesses. Can you talk a little bit about should Prop 209 be overturned? What impact, economic impact, would Prop 16 have on the campus's ability to extend more contracts and services to disadvantaged populations?
Thank you for the question. We have not, at this point, I don't have an analysis of that, but that's something that I can get to you. We can do that in the coming time. That's not something I have available right now.
That's fine. But as I understand, in the original move 209 forward, there's a misconception that it was pushed forth by just the education community. In fact, the development community was extremely eager to move 209. And what many of us have learned on the advocacy side who do work around racial justice, the monies lost from minority-owned businesses pre-209, both women and people of color and LGBTQ and other protected classes, no longer could government institutions do particular outreach and or procure services based on race or based on gender. And so my hope is that with this support position, we're also affirming that in the hundreds of millions of dollars that this institution will be contracting out over the years to come for not only construction services, but all contracts, that we would take into account both prime and subcontractors being represented from minority and women-owned businesses would increase. So thank you very much.
Trustee Simon, I would just add, I would thank you for the comments and the question. And though we don't have all of the answers right now, I think it's a really good point, and we would be happy to work with our colleagues in business and finance and academic affairs to bring back to the board at a later date the full analysis of opportunities and positive impacts we think will occur at the university. So thank you for raising that.
My understanding is that Equal Justice Society is an organization, a C3 organization in California that has worked to do the C3 analysis of resources lost to communities of color and women-owned businesses as a result of 209. I don't have their stuff in front of me, but I know that they've been a research source for many folks. So would love for the US, for the CSU to have that analysis around our particular contracts. Thanks.
Good. Thank you.
All right. See no further questions. I think we can move on to the second item. Thank you, Nicole, very much. And Garrett. The second information item is a federal legislative update. This is the federal update. The item will be presented by Garrett Ashley again and Jim Gelb, who is Assistant Vice Chancellor for Federal Relations. Vice Chancellor Garrett Ashley will once again begin the presentation.
Thank you once again, Trustee Farrar. Today, we take the unusual step of providing a mid-year federal relations update. As I mentioned, introducing the state update, this is an unusual year. There has been significant activity in Washington, D.C. relative to higher education and the connection and coordination with state government in response to COVID-19 is unprecedented. 6 months ago, we were talking about impeachment and reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. The novel coronavirus pandemic has upended all of that and dominated federal policymaking since March, including with regard to higher education. This presentation will review CSU's activities and actions in Washington this year and provide a glimpse of what we might expect later this summer. Assistant Vice Chancellor Jim Gelb will provide the update. Jim?
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Ashley. Since the onset of the pandemic, CSU advocates from across the system have actively sought relief and support for our students and institutions. To maximize our leverage, we have frequently joined forces with the California community colleges, the University of California, as well as with key players from across the national higher education community. We focused especially on obtaining quick emergency funding to assist students, as well as direct funding to help financially stabilize our institutions. In addition, the system has advocated for regulatory flexibility related to student aid programs and compliance requirements. Several important relief measures were enacted this spring. The largest was the CARES Act, a $2 trillion package which included numerous provisions geared specifically towards students and institutions of higher education. The CARES Act provided approximately $563 million in direct support to CSU students and campuses. Most of that was distributed by the Department of Education under a formula weighted toward institutions with large numbers of Pell Grant recipients, like the CSU. Under that formula, more than $525 million was allocated across the 23 CSU campuses. Half of that, or roughly $263 million, was designated for students as emergency grant aid. The CSU created a framework to ensure these funds were distributed as rapidly and equitably as possible. Unfortunately, Education Department guidance limited these emergency dollars to students who are eligible for Title IV aid. To ensure that all of our students, including DACA and international students, received relief, we complemented federal funds with CSU resources to form the CSU CARES initiative to provide emergency grant funding for all CSU students with COVID-19 induced financial need. The other half of the formula money goes to institutional aid that may be used to cover a wide array of expenses related to the disruption of campus operations due to COVID-19. Our campuses continue to gather data and determine which holes they want to fill with their institutional allocations. A separate pot of CARES Act funding was designated for Hispanic serving institutions, Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions, or ANAPISI, and other minority serving institutions. 22 CSU campuses received an additional $38 million through these provisions. These are also flexible funds for a wide range of uses. For the most part, campuses are still assessing the best uses of these resources. The CARES Act also provided significant regulatory flexibilities related to student aid that were important to students and institutions in light of the rapid pivot to online instruction, as well as the hardships brought on by COVID-19. In addition, the CSU has been a regular advocate on behalf of veterans during the pandemic, including on successful efforts to increase flexibility in GI Bill programs, to maintain their benefits and programs transitioning to online platforms, as well as their housing allowances. Next slide. While the billions of dollars in funding for higher education in the CARES Act was significant and appreciated, it was still well short of ongoing needs of the CSU and the higher education community. Thus, the CSU has continued to advocate, alongside others, for injecting an additional $47 billion nationally to support students and institutions. CSU Outreach helped garner 42 signatures from California House members on a letter to their leadership in support of this request. We have also advocated for additional direct funding for Hispanic serving and ANAPISI campuses, and supported ensuring that Dreamers are eligible for emergency aid. In May, the House passed its proposal for another phase of COVID-19 relief called the HEROES Act. This $3 trillion plus bill would provide significant resources for state and local governments that would be subject to maintenance of effort requirements related to support for public higher education. It also provides about $37 billion for institutions of higher education and an additional $1.7 billion for minority serving institutions. And it allows DACA recipients and international students to receive emergency grants. A very rough estimate is that the HEROES Act, if enacted as passed by the House, would provide over $900 million to CSU students and campuses. The Senate, however, has been much slower to act on additional COVID-19 relief, and its leadership is inclined toward a different and far more modest package than the House HEROES bill. As part of ongoing efforts on this front, the CSU successfully encouraged both of California's senators to sign on to a Dear Colleague letter in support of the additional $47 billion in higher education funding in an eventual Senate package. And recently, the White House has shown increasing interest in a new relief measure that would reflect its priority of reopening the economy. Earlier this month, Chancellor White was asked to testify before the House Subcommittee on Higher Education and Workforce Investment at a hearing to examine the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. His testimony addressed the challenges faced by the CSU system and its students in the wake of the pandemic, including the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on low-income students and students of color, the ways in which the CSU is responding to and coping with the pandemic, including steps being taken to protect the health and safety of students and staff and to ensure that students' basic needs are met, the impact of actions taken by Congress and the Department of Education in response to the pandemic, and the need for additional federal investments in state and local governments and institutions of higher education, particularly under-resourced institutions and institutions serving large shares of low-income students and students of color. The Chancellor repeatedly emphasized the helpful role that Congress could play in erasing recent state budget cuts and assisting our students, campuses, and communities. We expect serious negotiations to occur over the next few weeks among the House, the Senate, and the White House, with the goal of producing another substantial COVID-19 relief measure before the Congress takes a long August recess. Next slide. In addition to our efforts related directly to the pandemic, the CSU has continued to advocate for legislation to permanently protect and support Dreamers. Last year, the House passed the CSU-supported American Dream and Promise Act of 2019 on largely partisan lines. This legislation provides for conditional permanent residency and an earned path to citizenship for Dreamers. However, despite ongoing efforts by the CSU and many others, the Senate has shown no interest in moving legislation related to Dreamers. Last month, the Supreme Court rejected the Trump administration's rescission of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, stating that the Department of Homeland Security's process was arbitrary and capricious. The Trump administration has yet to formally respond to the court's decision, though the president has indicated he plans to once again take steps to phase out the program. We have also advocated on multiple occasions on behalf of international students. Most recently, we joined many others in the university and business communities to successfully reverse administration action that would have forced international students to take in-person classes in the fall or risk being sent home. Excellent. The ongoing pandemic continues to have a profound impact on both what gets done in Washington and on how. Most congressional business is being conducted virtually these days, especially in the House of Representatives. This has limited the amount of legislation being seriously considered. The long August recess is approaching, and the 2020 election looms. Thus, it is very unlikely that much of substance will get done between now and November, especially with regard to non-emergency measures. All of this adds up to pressure on the Congress and the White House to produce one more significant COVID-19 relief measure before the summer break. There remains a chance that some important work can be done in a post-election lame duck session, depending upon how that turns out. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
I think you're muted.
We can't hear you.
Trustee Farrar, you're on.
There we go. Okay. It was frozen up there. I'm sorry. Jim, thank you very much for your presentation. Sorry about that. Are there any questions now? I see Trustee Eisen.
Thank you, Chair Farrar. I wanted not to ask a question, but to comment on two things. First, the Chancellor's testimony before Congress. We were all sent around a copy of the testimony, and I know everybody has read it. It is an incredible document. For multiple reasons. We have talked a lot at our board meetings about telling the CSU story. And that document tells the CSU story in a way I've never really seen it presented before. There was a lot of media coverage when we announced in May that we would be online in the fall. And I know the Chancellor was on multiple channels at all times, but I was very kind of amused when our CSSA president was being interviewed on one of the national channels about the impact of this decision to go virtually totally online. And the interviewer said to him, aren't you worried, since there are institutions like Harvard who say they are going to have students back on their campuses, aren't you worried that the CSU students will all want to transfer to Harvard? I was A, trying to imagine that, but B, what I thought was extraordinarily amusing was, why would any CSU student want to transfer to Harvard, given what is being offered here? So I just wanted to make those comments and thank the Chancellor once again for his extraordinary leadership of this institution.
Thank you. I see Trustee Sebelius has a question.
Yes, again, not a question, but a comment, and a comment in regard to our undocumented students and our international students. It baffles me when European countries, in light of the European countries' concern about the drop-off of international students due to the pandemic, we are trying to place obstacles to their attendance at our universities. In Europe, the countries, not only the universities, the countries are struggling to bring in qualified students and qualified, educated laborers, and in many respects, professionals. And in reverse, those countries from where the students come, they usually lament the brain drain that these other countries can attract the brightest and the best. And it would be really a shame if we lost that brain power that is coming to us into the United States as international students. And of course, our DACA students, of course, are enrolled as well at universities, and they will get a tremendous investment in their education, and not to retain them is absolutely self-defeating. Not only is this the brain power that our nation will benefit from and our state, the international students also bring in additional revenue. They pay about 2.5 times as much tuition as our resident students do. And this is a very important revenue stream for many of our campuses. San Jose State has a high amount of international students, and we rely on them, and we want to rely on them. Also, international students at our campuses provide our domestic students an opportunity to interact with to get an international exposure. And that is even more so important at a time when we have canceled our own international programs due to the pandemic, and where maybe in subsequent years it will be harder financially for our students to go study abroad. At least in the interaction with our international students, they will get an exposure to other cultures, a broadening of their horizon. So I'm baffled, and I hope that when you advocate for support of international students and undocumented students, you can stress these points, that they're purely an asset to our institutions, to our students, and to the future of our state and nation.
All right, I see Trustee Kame's hand is up too as well.
Well, I just wanted to echo what Rumi said, and I wanted to add, when the policy came out and a lot of international students kind of heard about it, there was a lot of fear and anxiety over what the future will look like. And a lot of them were planning their travels, but they were so afraid that they might, get COVID while traveling. There was also a fear of, we, at least, a lot of students who are living, in the US in general have access to, Wi-Fi, the internet. And so a lot of them were also concerned that that might not be something that is accessible to them. And so I'm very thankful that the CSU joined other higher education institutions in standing up against this. And it's very disappointing to see that, members of our community are constantly being kind of picked out and really seen as foreigners in a way. And I just want to echo what Rumi said, just like the international students are kind of gaining an experience here, even as a student who's, studying at San Diego State, I'm still learning a lot from my international students and my peers.
All right. Seeing no other questions, again, let me thank all for that presentation. And Chair Kimbell, that concludes the business of the Committee on Governmental Relations.
Thank you, Chair Farrar.